Hi, everyone. Welcome back to another Museum on Tap happy hour. I'm your host, Jessica Urban, and today I'm having a drink with Bob Genheimer, the George Rieveschl Curator of Archaeology at Cincinnati Museum Center. Hey, Bob, welcome to happy hour.
Welcome to you, Jessica. I'm glad to be here.
We're glad to have you. So we'll do a quick cheers here to you and to everybody at home. Thank you all for joining us. So, Bob, in your role as curator, you supervise our archaeology lab, our archaeology and ethnology volunteers, and also all of Museum Center's field work. Is there a part of archaeological work or research that interests you the most?
I actually would say I love the field work. We only do it 1 month of the year, and at the end of the month, I'm tired of it. But I always want to get back into it. Next year, I want to do it again, and I feel that way now, even though we weren't going to do it anyway, and now we're certainly not going to do it. So, but I want to get out in the field. That's what I do.
So, when you're out in the field, I have to imagine that things can be unpredictable, especially compared to other parts of work. You know, laboratories are so controlled, but when you're out in the field, you're kind of at the mercy of nature and the elements. Has anything crazy ever happened to you when you're out there?
Well, lots of things crazy have happened. And so, I mean, just like anybody that works outside, we have to deal with the weather, and that's both good weather and bad weather. But I mean that it's not just rain and wind that's troublesome to us. Sometimes it's the sun, the heat, the humidity. The sun just dries up the soil and bakes it into a solid object, and we can't dig if that happens. So what we normally do is set up dining flies. If you've ever been out to our excavations, we put them on 1x2s, and it just covers a large area, keeps the ground moist, keeps the screeners out of the sun, and keeps the excavators out of the sun. And it works really well, except when you get high winds or heavy rains, and then things tend to fall apart. And it can get pretty funny at times, and we laughed a lot about trying to hold up tarps and all this while it happens. But most cases it works. We can do it. We can work while it's raining. But there's one time that we really got caught. So what you learn to do, and you know, smartphones are wonderful. We have radar at our fingertips, and we can look and see when the storms are coming. And as the field director, I have to make sure that I know when these storms are coming, because our first priority, of course, is the safety of our crew. So one day we were out there, and there were storms predicted, and I had checked the radar. There was nothing showing, just a little bit of stuff over Cincinnati. And I didn't think anything of it. And then I got a phone call from one of my colleagues at the Museum Center who said, "You guys have to shelter because there's a nasty storm heading your way." And I just looked at the radar. And so I looked at it again, and they were absolutely correct. It had just ballooned. And I looked over the edge of the trees about 300 feet from us, and I saw these black clouds just flying towards us. And I got everyone to close everything down. We dropped the tarps, put our heavy screen frames on. These things weigh like 120 pounds a piece.
Wow.
We put them on there, sent them to the car, and we just got into the van that we had for equipment when this thing came over the tree line, and it was pushing a wind layer in front of it. So leaves, branches, it was even knocking birds to the ground. This wind was really coming. So we got into the van. I started the van because I wanted to get it so it would face into the wind, but I didn't have time. And this wind hit us, and we were plastered. Remember, we're 300 feet from the tree line. We were getting hit by limbs and
Wow.
leaves and all this stuff. And then all of a sudden, the tires on the wind side of the van came off the ground. And they went off the ground at like a foot. And I was in the van with this other guy, and we thought, "Oh my God, this van's going to flip over."
Oh.
But it didn't. All of a sudden, it just slammed back down. And I thought, "Oh, that's great." But then I looked over. The wind had picked up our screen frames and tossed them 30, 40, 50 feet away, ripping the tarps out of the ground. They were tied in the ground. We found the tarps 400 to 500 feet away where they hit another tree line. They just blew that far. And of course, it started raining. We got all this stuff drenched. But my heart was beating. I remember that. And the wind died. It lasted for maybe 45 seconds. That was it. But it scared the living daylights out of all of us, even the people in their cars in the parking lot. So that's why we're pretty, it's important for us to take a look at the weather and make sure that nobody gets injured.
Yeah, I can imagine seeing those big black clouds coming at you would be scary if they were
Mm-hmm.
moving that fast, and worrying about you and your crew, but also all the things that you're working on. I can
Yeah,
imagine that weather has a big effect
yes, it
on what
does.
you're researching as well.
Yeah.
So when you do go out to research, do you always go out knowing what you're looking for or having an idea about what you're hoping to find, or is there always kind of this element of surprise?
There's always an element of surprise. You know, I guess one could say if you knew what you were going to find, there wouldn't be any reason to actually dig. We do use technology and clues when we're at the Han site, our field school site. We use remote sensing, most of it magnetometry, which is can see, it looks for minor disruptions in the magnetic field below the ground. So all these big pit features, house patterns, things like that, they can show up when you run this piece of equipment over the ground. So we use that to select where we want to dig.
Mhm.
So it saves us the trouble of just putting a unit out there and then just being totally surprised on what we're going to hit. I can tell if I see a pit feature, I can put a unit right over the top of it. So it's very efficient. And it's also, we're testing the efficacy of that remote sensing and what it actually sees in the ground, which is pretty cool stuff.
So I know that you have been an archaeologist for many years. What is one of the coolest or most surprising things that you found out in the field?
I think there's a series of these marine shell gorges from the Newtown Firehouse site, where the village of Newtown Administrative Hall is today. And these are really extremely cool. They're like cereal bowl size pieces about this big. And they're engraved, it's marine shell, they're engraved with animals. One of them has a possum, one of them has a panther or a mountain lion, and another one has a composite animal, a chimera, that has another panther and what we believe to be a Carolina parakeet. So we refer to it as a pantherkeet. So it's a above ground, above world, lower world spirits combined into one animal. They're absolutely exquisite. And I remember when I found the first one, it was in the early 80s, and I turned it over and I thought, oh my God, I'm only like 27 years old and I'll never find anything as cool as this again, and my career is over. And then I found two more, so it wasn't true. So they're pretty cool.
That sounds really cool.
Yeah.
Um, in all of the time that you have been looking into things in the field, are there ever times, when you say in the field, I picture you in just like a big open space. Do you ever go into other places to look for things?
We do. We've actually done a lot of survey work where we actually don't actually dig, but look at what's on the surface of the ground. And I've also, in the past, have done a lot of urban archaeology. So both in in the city of Covington and in Cincinnati. Also, I've worked in Frankfort and Lexington, Kentucky, doing urban archaeology. And actually, I like the historical archaeology or urban parts because it's a marriage between archaeology and history. And I'm kind of interested in both. And plus, you can look stuff up when you're digging historic stuff. You can't really do that in the prehistoric stuff. So it's a lot more fun sometimes to do the urban archaeology.
Can you tell us about some of the stuff that you found as an urban archaeologist? That's something I didn't even know that was a term. That's really cool.
Well, there's a couple stories that we have from work that we did downtown Cincinnati in the Queensgate area, what's referred to as the Betts Longworth Historic District. So it's north of City Hall, going up to where Taft High School is, those blocks, and they're on the other side of Music Hall. And it was blocks that had been developed in the 1840s. And we got involved in the early 1980s. I was working for Miami Purchase Association, which is now Cincinnati Preservation Association. And we got involved in excavating several privy shafts or outhouse shafts. And on the surface, they may not seem like they'd be great features to dig, but actually they're wonderful. They are terrific features anthropologically because people throw things into privy shafts or outhouse shafts that they never expect anyone else to go in and find. They certainly didn't expect us to come in 100 years later and dig this stuff back up. So there's a couple stories in that. And the first one, which is got a lot of play, is usually referred to as the policeman in the Privy. And it's not that we actually found an actual policeman, but we did find his uniform. So we were down about 13 feet in this 21-foot deep privy shaft, or limestone laid, circular. And we encountered this whole array of objects that we were first kind of confused a bit because the stuff was still dirty. But when we got it back in the lab and looked at it, it was the remains of a policeman's uniform. The cloth had disintegrated, but all the hardware, the buttons, the badges, insignias, buckles, they were all still there and in good shape. There was even a two-tone police whistle, his call box keys. But something that was really cool is in the pocket was a 41 caliber Derringer called a Southerner Derringer. So this dates to the late 1890s. Policemen weren't issued sidearms until later in the 20th century. So this policeman had this gun and it was loaded. It has a tilt barrel, removable barrel. The 41 caliber slug is still in it. The barrel wasn't located. So we thought this is really cool. Then we thought, well, who is this person? And you can't really just go to city directories. You'd have to read them from cover to cover to figure out who lived at the house. So we looked at this piece of rubber and metal, which was badly corroded, and cleaned it up, and it was a stamp. And it had the policeman's name on it. His name was Dustin, D-U-S-T-I-N. We looked him up in the city directories, and there he was, living at that house from the mid-1890s until about 1900 or 1901. So we knew who he was. And then it was like, well, why did he do this? So we did some research, and this is back in the 80s, early 80s. There's no internet. You can't look things up digitally. There's no digital information. So we were sort of hamstrung with that. But we did find out something about his father. His father was a prominent divorce and defense attorney in Cincinnati. He was a Civil War hero. He was called Captain Potter Dustin. And he died in 1899, I believe in September of 1899. And our subsequent research, when we did some stuff later on, shows that it's about this point when his father dies that Charles' life sort of unravels in big ways. So we found out now you can look up in the Cincinnati Enquirer, it's all digitized, and there's a really nice article in May of 1900 about Charles shooting another policeman. Charles was working in Avondale neighborhood. He wasn't a real Cincinnati policeman. He was a mercantile policeman. And these were people who were charged with guarding people and businesses. He got into an altercation actually with the police officer who was guarding the mayor-elect of Cincinnati, Julius Fleshman, who was the grandfather of our Julius Fleshman in the museum with all the Fleshman travel stuff. So it's actually pretty cool. His name was Jacob Strickmeyer. He got into a fight with him. He shot Jacob in the leg on a streetcar. He was arrested. He lost his police powers. He lost his license to carry a gun. And this was just the start. In December of 1901, less than a year later, we see Charles again in an Enquirer article for the same thing. He's back with his mercantile policeman. He gets in an argument with another policeman who happens to be the brother-in-law of Jacob Strickmeyer, who he shot before. He pulls his gun on this policeman. He's subdued, and he runs away. There's an arrest warrant written for him. He's caught the next day, and he actually tears up the arrest warrant, and which is a crime. And he pulls his gun on the arresting officer, but the arresting officer subdues him, and he goes to trial. And then there's another article about him. They're testing his mental stability in court, and they determined that he was not insane, but that he was a danger, too much of a danger to be let out. So he was sent to the Cincinnati workhouse for 18 months. And then something happened in the workhouse because 10 months into his sentence, he was transferred to Longview Insane Asylum on the northern side of Cincinnati, where he remained until his death in 1933. So the cool part of the story is that archaeology showed something we would have never known. So we have these digital newspaper articles, but here we have the actual uniform, and I fully suspect that that uniform went into the outhouse that last time when he ran away before he was arrested the next day. He was essentially concealing evidence in a place that he knew no one was going to look until we did.
That's wild.
Yeah. So
So,
there's,
so cool.
yeah, there's another story about cats, and this is in the Privy right next door. So about 9 to 11 feet deep in this Privy, and this really astounded us, we ran into the remains of 55 cats. Only 2 or 3 of these cats were of reproductive age. Most of them were kittens. They were probably litters. So obviously somebody was getting rid of litters of kittens in the neighborhood. And this happened a little early in the late 1880s. And again, we're trying to figure out why would they do this? And so we looked at a number of things, and we think that, for one thing, health and sanitation was probably important to this. The city of Cincinnati was known as a very dirty city in the late 19th century. You look at the disease outbreaks, so there was cholera, diphtheria, dysentery, scarlet fever, typhoid, all these diseases. People knew that, that cleanliness was important, and cats in the 19th century were looked at not as kindly as they are today. They were really looked at as vectors of disease and examples of bad luck. And also the neighborhood was changing by the 1880s and 1890s, even though Cincinnati was always the scene of immigration. By this point, most of the areas of immigration in the downtown basin were now Eastern European, and the newspapers routinely ridiculed these folks as being not as clean as others. So I really suspect that there was probably one individual who was taking all this information in and decided, well, I'm just going to clean up all the cats in the neighborhood, which gets to the main point of this, which is this is truly aberrant behavior in any century. You wouldn't do that today, and it would not have been looked upon kindly in the 19th century either. He certainly didn't stick it out in the trash in front of the house. He threw them to one place where he knew no one was going to look. So it's sort of like out of sight, out of mind. So we'll never know the true rationale for why this person did it. But again, archaeology sort of showed the darker side of some of the things that were going on in the 19th century in Cincinnati.
Yeah, I had no idea you could learn so much from an outhouse. That's not what I would have expected. But
yeah,
it seems like you can learn a whole lot. That policeman story is going to stick with me. I feel like that could be some sort of true crime podcast these days.
Well, I've always thought about writing a novel on it. Of course, I never do, but I always think about it,
Well, you have time now, Bob.
Yeah, but I have to have a body, and if I wrote the novel, there would actually have to be a body in there, I think. So, yeah, you're right, I have time.
You do. I'll read your first draft when we get back to work.
Okay.
Well, thank you so much for coming on Happy Hour today, Bob, for sharing those stories with us. Thank you to everyone who tuned in. I hope you learned something cool, just like I did. And we will see you next time at Happy Hour. Cheers, Bob.
Cheers to you, Jessica.